Let's start recording. Okay, we're good.
Alright, should we do an introduction then?
All right. Hello, everyone. This is my 2 cents. I'm going to be moderating a debate between Atomic and Hoplu versus Eso and Filthy Heretic on the topic of Hoppeanism and agorism. So, if anyone has anything they want to say before we get started.
Me and Eso are... not me and Eso. Me and Atomic are in the affirmative on the belief that Hoppe, or Hans Hermann Hoppe, is being misinterpreted and is overall generally a good guy, has good ideas, etc., etc.
And
anything you need to add, Atomic?
Pretty much what Hoplu said.
Yeah.
And we are a lot more skeptical of the contributions that Hans Hermann Hoppe has made to the anarchist movement, and would even arguably have been a malefactor.
Specifically, what I would like to clarify, and that we can do this, after the introductory statement, but I'd like to clarify, because that's sort of the problem that I've encountered with a lot of this. The main problem, at least in sort of forming the foundational premise regarding the debate about Hoppe, is there's like both sides seem to have different conceptions of good, or how actually something could apply to society, like the sort of theory that Hoppe is proposing. So sometime in the debate, I'd like to see that specified, because otherwise this is just going to be another pointless shouting match.
All right, then. So, for format for this debate, each side will be given a 5-minute opening statement followed by a 10-minute cross-examination, in which the other side will be allowed to ask questions to the group that has just given their opening statement. Cross-examination is solely for asking questions for clarification, not to get into the actual rebuttal, which will come after that. And we'll do 2 sets of rebuttals. So for the 2 respective topics that we're debating, there will be opening statements followed by cross-examination followed by 2 sets of rebuttals. So for Atomic and Hoplu, your opening statement arguing in the affirmative in defense of Hoppe, your 5 minutes begins now.
All right. Well, I think that the important thing to note about Hans Hermann Hoppe is that he's, like, people like to think that he's some kind of totally separate or very different ideology from the rest of voluntarism or the Mises Rothbard tradition, or to that degree even Lysander Spooner tradition of libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism or individualist anarchism or whatever you want to call it. And I, like, me and Atomic both believe that Hoppe has basically added a lot of good to the anarchist or liberty movement, such as, for example, argumentation ethics, which I personally believe sort of codifies or justifies property rights and the non-aggression principle better than any system or chain of logic before so, but that's just me. But also, his perspective on history, or the quote-unquote progress of man, has basically shaken up sort of the traditional view on society, which anarchists and libertarians have fallen prey to, including good ones such as Mises and Rothbard, as well as, I believe, Spooner. But as well, and he even clarifies a lot of what sort of an anarchist society would look like without a state, which, on another note, Hoppe does define the state pretty close to what Eso and Filthy and Spooner would say it is, but a bit more, I don't know. But anyways, I believe that it's sort of a misrepresentation and unfair thing to do, to like say that Hans Hermann Hoppe is a statist because because of either A, quote mining, or B, his quote unquote followers that haven't read a word that that hasn't read a word that Hoppe wrote. I just believe that it's unfair and unreasonable and kind of destructive to characterize Hoppe in sort of the physical removal, Augusto Pinochet, he's a monarchist, alt-right, fascist kind of thing that's here, or a neo-mercantilist. That's all I have to say. I'm on to you, Atomic, if you have to say anything.
Libertarianism. This is what got me into Hoppe. Libertarianism is about the resolution of conflict, or, clashes between individuals. And we know that private property is the best way to alleviate conflicts. I think Hoppe's view on contractual society is the best for protecting private property, especially when it comes to, freedom of association between covenant communities. And I also believe that on the cultural aspect, I like Hoppe because he's against what modern libertarianism has become, which is a bunch of, hedonists and people who, like the capital L, legalize weed.
You have 1 minute remaining.
All right. Well, then that's pretty much it. The cultural aspect and the private property aspect are why I like Hoppe.
All right. Do you wish to forfeit your remaining time?
Yes.
All right. All right. So that brings the affirmative side's opening statement to an end. At this point, Filthy and Eso will have up to 10 minutes for cross-examination. I'll remind you this is solely to ask questions for clarification about their opening statement. It is not time to actually get into your rebuttal. So your 10 minutes for Eso and Filthy, your 10 minutes for cross-examination begin now.
I wanted to clarify something about like Eso was talking about. How would we define good in the context of contributions to libertarianism?
Basically, I'd say that basically just stronger arguments against the forces of evil, neoconservatism, neoliberalism, communism, socialism, fascism, etc., etc., being able to better define and better point out the evil of the state. And Hoppe's goal is basically pretty much the same as, all of ours here, to secure, respect private property, to prevent violence, taxation, war, etc., and to annihilate the state.
That's sort of my biggest problem with Hoppe, though. It's not like a lot of people have sort of misunderstood a lot of my previous arguments, where they seem to be under the impression that I think Hoppe is literally arguing for like a neo-feudalism. No, I don't think that is the case. I think that there's a decent case to be made that he does have a very similar, at least, conclusion in mind, or at least conclusion ethically somewhat resembles the sort of 19th century libertarian tradition. My problem, though, is that an argument and a methodology is only as good as its presuppositions. So there's a decent case to be made. A lot of the conclusions which Marx came to, have some merit to them if you really actually were to read his philosophy. But where his philosophy fails is how he structures his presuppositions to come to that conclusion. It works.
I'm going to interrupt you quick, so I'll remind you this is cross-examination. Point is for clarification. So if you're getting into a rebuttal at this point, save that for your opening statement.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to sort of set the groundwork for my question.
Okay, all right.
So what I was going to say, though, is that, Marx came to a lot of these conclusions which have merit, but his entire presupposition, it's very obvious he saw these conclusions, but sort of worked backwards and built his presuppositions around what he saw, but he didn't really understand what he saw. So as a result, you get a jumbled conclusion which doesn't really make any sense, even though it clearly structurally resembles something which is sound. So the problem that I'm at here is that a lot of Hoppe's sort of presuppositions are some really, I would say, at best dubious positions. So the sort of question I have is, you say Hoppe does a lot of good things. I guess you'd have to point to me a specific example. I mean, you cited argumentation ethics, but all that's really, I'd say that's arguably a step backwards, because it sort of cements the idea that information is objective into the mix, or that there's an objective way to communicate information, and the idea that culture somehow is divorced from human action. That's another big problem, because it sort of distorts how the mainstream libertarian movement sees people actually develop their conceptions of society around them. Hoppe is not really that. I think he's literally advocating for statism. I think his presuppositions are exacerbating the problems which modern libertarianism in its messaging and how it politically organizes embodies greatly today. My point, though, is I think that you're actually mischaracterizing our criticism.
All right. Now, I think that the argumentation ethics thing is something for an entirely different discussion, but I don't think he ever separated culture from human action, or at the very least never said that culture doesn't have any effect on human action or whatnot. But anyways, I think this is something for the rebuttal stage, but I don't really know what negative presuppositions you're referring to.
The idea that culture forms separate from human action. He very much, like a good half of Democracy, the God That Fails. Maybe his arguments don't explicitly make this case, but a lot of the entire premise of a covenant community is rooted from one of the main ideas it's rooted from is that culture is separate from human action.
I think this is something for the rebuttal stage, but I have a response to that, but I think it's more appropriate for the rebuttal stage. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
And I'm gonna say, I understand if you need to lay some groundwork in order to ask your question, but still there shouldn't be much debating going on. Just clarifying points from the opening statement. So
that's what I did.
Okay.
I mean, and that's sort of why
I guess I'm not sure that I would put to Atomic and Hoplu. Are you able? Do you have an answer for that, or are you saying that you'd rather respond to that in the rebuttals?
I believe that's more appropriate for the rebuttal stage.
Okay.
This is exactly why I sort of started off by asking for a clarification on what good or bad means.
Yeah.
Because, when you just sort of say, Hoppe made the case for anarchism, there's sort of a lot to go over in that sort of general statement.
Yeah. I'd say that, again, that good is sort of the continuation of the Mises Rothbard Spooner tradition of libertarianism, or liberalism or anarchism or what have you. That he's basically sort of an expansion on it, and that he's really just sort of the evolution of it. It's really just not some separate ideology.
When it comes to what he's done that is good, how I define good is how he advantages libertarianism, and I think he provides insights that many libertarians haven't, or at least modern libertarians haven't taken into account, such as why private property exists, the history of it, and what it ultimately does.
As well as the very niche view on like, this is mostly for the fact that he's a German and not bound by American history like the rest of us are, and that he's able to provide sort of a non-Americanized perspective on history and human development, which American libertarianism, even in the Spooner days, has kind of been infected by. But yeah,
What do you mean?
You'll have to clarify how, one, that is a factor at all, and two, why a non-American perspective is somehow going to be superior.
Basically, that Americans, even the most hardcore anarchists, tend to have too much of a soft spot for democracies, republics, the founding fathers, etc., etc.
You're kidding me?
He wasn't that. I'm not saying that Spooner was a fanboy. I'm just saying that even he had a bit of influence. It's good to take other perspectives from time to time. It's a minor point, mind you, but it still exists.
It's ridiculous. Spooner was one of the first libertarians to really concretely make the case against the concept of group rights. He was one of the a big section of No Treason, his most famous work, was to refuting the idea of social contract theory and democracy. If anything, a lot of modern individualist arguments against democracy owe tribute to Spooner's arguments, because he essentially single-handedly...
All right, 10 minutes are up. At this point, Eso Filthy, you will have 5 minutes for your opening statement. Arguing in the negative against Hoppa. Your 5 minutes begin now.
Eso, I thought you were going to start.
I thought you were going to... All right.
All right. As a courtesy, I'll start that time again. Your 5 minutes begin now.
Oh, that's a little unfortunate.
Okay, I can start. So the big problem that I see with Hop is not necessarily that he is a bad man in some way, or even to say that he is, or his conclusions are erroneous. I mean, it's very clear, both in his lectures and his literary body of work, that the guy definitely has the right conclusions, that he wants to see the state eradicated from society as much as any of us. But that said, as Eso stated earlier, his methodology is incredibly questionable at best, and at times absolutely disastrous. Now, of course, one of the first points that I would like to bring up in regards to this is in Democracy, the God That Failed. He makes several criticisms of democracy, but in so doing contrasts it with monarchy. Mainly that of course is absolutely accurate, because the democracy is of course deserving of criticism. Nobody disputes this. However, in so doing, he implies an affirmation and support of monarchy, claiming that it has a longer, or rather lower, time preference, and thus is more interested and has more interest in maintaining the value of their country, their society in general, and thus is going to end up with positive results. Couple this with how he describes a covenant community, that is to say, a society with a common culture in which all people who engage in degenerate behavior are going to be kicked out, or, depending on how you interpret physical removal works, simply ostracized from society. he, of course, also goes into the argument that any form of libertarianism is necessarily going to have a very strong conservative culture. This, of course, being exclusionary to any form of quote-unquote degeneracy that might have previously existed. This being said, it makes perfect sense that the observational effect that me and Eso have both noticed in regards to libertarians who adopt Hoppeanism, they, within a year, if not months, go from being libertarian to monarchist to fascist in some manner. I mean, I'm pretty sure you all are aware of Tanner Croson. Just a year ago, he was Hoppian. Now we have a screenshot of him saying on his own server saying that if your opinions are anti-white, then you get banned from his server. So I think what's really going on is that he might have all the right ideas, but he is a typhoid Mary, a carrier for all sorts of presuppositions and ideas that are fundamentally antithetical to liberty and to the liberty movement. And whether he knows this or not, I'm going to go ahead and give Hop the benefit of the doubt on this. He is arguably single-handedly responsible for a libertarian to alt-right pipeline. Eso, did you want to add something?
I was going to say I don't think he's single-handedly responsible. I think that Hoppe is more the culmination of a lot of symptoms.
So if you're speaking, I'm not hearing it. Is anyone else?
I can hear him.
Oh,
I can hear him.
you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so... But what I was going to say is, I think that Hoppe was sort of the culmination of a lot of problems made in the early 20th century by the sort of libertarian political movements. What happened at that time is in like the 1910s, 1920s, many of the libertarian political movements who existed were terrified of what they saw as an emergence of state socialism in the West. So what they did as a result is they sort of, as a desperate measure, adopted the party strategy, and they tried to ally with the group which they deemed
30 seconds remaining.
Most opposed to state socialism was conservatism, and as a result, that's mainly where the problems with libertarianism began. This sort of attempt to adopt conservative strategies, you know, the partyarchist messaging, how their conclusions are presupposed to be met through partyarchy, how you need a strong man in order to have your conclusions met, you need to sacrifice libertarian philosophy. And Hoppe is just sort of the end conclusion of that.
The 5-minute opening statement against Hoppe. At this point, Atomic and Hoplu, you will have 10 minutes for cross-examination. Again, this is just for getting out points of clarification. So your 10 minutes for cross-examination begin now.
All right.
So Filthy, first of all, when you were speaking about Hoppe's view on monarchy, did you take into account that he only said monarchy was preferable to democracy? Not that he said democracy is a good thing, or not that he said monarchy is a good thing. Rather, they're both bad, but one is more preferable than the other.
Oh, I understand.
Basically, that democracy is a further degeneration of the state.
Oh, I understand that completely. However, ultimately, whether or not people are going to interpret it in the way you or I would is not entirely up to me.
And that's sort of what I mean when he's making arguments sympathetic to political authority. The idea that there can be a better state is just completely alien to libertarian philosophy. According to libertarianism is itself an inherent evil because it suppresses, it claims dominion over other people's moral agency. And 19th century libertarians completely decimated welfare statism and business government partnership. I'd say mid 20th, late 20th century libertarians ever could.
Alright, but you realize basically that he wasn't legitimizing monarchy or saying that it was a good thing, but just saying that it was sort of a self-defense mechanism of the state to preserve itself in an industrial economy or an industrial society where it would be more easily uprooted by the previous feudal order, which was more decentralized than both absolute monarchies and state democracies.
Oh, and that's another thing. You say that sort of Hoppe's historical conception is more accurate than most libertarians, or it attempts to explain more. And I would agree with that, but you know, a lot of his historical conceptions are just demonstrably wrong, and again make a series of underlying assumptions which case for political authority. And this would be a great example of that. The reason why states adopted a sort of democracy or republican model is because the feudal system had collapsed. It's because of the failings of organizations like the East India Trade Company and the exponential rate of debt which they'd perceived. And a lot of the mismanagement which occurred under feudal economies, and the fact that, you know, little actual improvements to the quality of life or rate of production, or just the amount of production which could occur. And on top of that, as I've made the case before, it was also because feudalism is sort of built upon a social order which relies a sort of monolithic view of religion. The printing press was, I would argue, the point where political authority, the ball got rolling to where that was going to eventually die, the invention of the printing press, because that's exactly what it allowed for. Diversity of anything, absolutely the state killer. So I think, and in any sort of human action, you'll notice that there is, outside of maybe familial biological necessity, things tend to decentralize because of how humans actually have a different conception of all interests, and only relatively connect on some areas, which is, you know, sort of the basis by which trade can occur.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Right. All right.
All right, but yeah, that's the other. But my is the idea that any sort of free society would naturally centralize to any extent in the model by which resources are organized is, I think, a bit ridiculous and sort of contradicted by observable reality. Like, if you see any time of massive economic depression, do people stick around and try and associate within the white markets? No, they subvert the system which exists, because ultimately all human action is dictated upon what each individual perceives to be in their own material interest, and centralization can only be promoted as something which exists in their interests. You know, essentially coerces all of the other options out of legal society.
Right.
Is that all you had to say? Okay.
You were going to ask me something?
I was going to ask Eso something. Eso, what was weird to me is you said there's no difference between the evils of the states, right? There's no difference in the state, they're all evil. True. And that is true. But would you deny that there's different types of evil? Like, there's murdering someone versus genociding an entire population. Are those two on equal scales? Or is it not, or is it, not equal, and there is evil that outranks another evil?
That is a question of scale. That's sort of a problem a lot of people make. It's not that one's more unethical than another, it's that they're both unethical and that one of them is on a sort of practical scale greater than the other, as in there's more cost that it has and more compensation that the criminal would need to compensate at their expense for victims.
Well, then if you talk, okay, let's say theft versus murder. Is there not one that's more preferable there, or are they both? They're both bad. We know that, but is there one that's, if it has to happen, it's more preferable?
Yeah, and that's a question of scale. One's not more unethical than the other. They're both unethical for the same reason. It's just that the way in which the victim is compensated is different.
So if you were to judge something and you were to say, let's say if you were put in charge of an event that had to happen, and either someone would get murdered or someone would get their bike stolen, which one would you choose in that situation?
I wouldn't choose either because I don't want either to happen, and this is sort of the problem with a centralized system of arbitration, is that you can't just sort of if the point is that you're trying to make there needs to be a sort of centralized system of arbitration to an extent like what would exist in a covenant community. This is exactly why that system both can't have ethical merit and also is impractical, and people wouldn't organize in this sort of model. What is compensated to the victim of each crime is ultimately determined by a rather infinite variation of circumstances, which by which I mean they could vary in a practically infinite number of ways, depending on how the criminal and victim both evaluate their circumstances and surrounding that.
1 minute of cross-examination remaining.
Yeah, I have a very important question I do want to ask.
All right, I'll answer.
All right, what does covenant community mean to you two?
Covenant community, to me, refers to a privately owned city in which people choose to or choose not to live, buy land, or rather rent land from them, and they must agree to a certain contract in order as a condition for renting from the property.
All right, Eso?
I have essentially the same definition.
Right. All right.
That's
all I have.
But that's what I mean when I was saying that a covenant community would have effectively centralized arbitration, because it would be an entire city owned by, one person and everyone there. And this is a terrible format. A proper Hoppean debate has to go on longer.
All right. At this point, the debate is going to continue. At this point, Atomic and Hoplu, you have 5 minutes to make a rebuttal, your first rebuttal. Your 5 minutes begin now.
All right. I think that all there really is to say about monarchy is that he's not praising monarchy. He's only saying that the state, he's basically debunking the myth that the switch between monarchy to democracy was quote-unquote progress, or that it makes the state any better, and he's sort of disproving that myth. In fact, democracy is worse for the various reasons he mentioned, but really that's all there is to say about it. But before I get to covenant communities, I do want to say it's a bit on the, to put it very bluntly, fallacious side to say that Hoppe is wrong or should be discredited, because some people who, above all else, more than likely have not read him, became or interpreted him as being sort of their justification for monarchy or justification for becoming a fascist. Like, for example, Tanner Croson. Like, again, I don't believe that Tanner Croson is an example of anything, because he's gone all around the political spectrum for one reason or another. I'd say that a better example would be someone like a Trudil Twink, or I don't remember the other guy's name, but anyways, there's also, again, not every person who follows or reads Hoppe becomes a Nazi or a monarchist. That's kind of the it's kind of akin to saying that PewDiePie is turning people into Poltards and Wignats, but that's just how I'd put it. Anyways, for what little time I have left, I will say that Covenant communities are not inherently a private city. They're not a one-size-fits-all form. Things like, say, voluntary communes, that's that I know for a fact that you don't have any ethical objections to that, but that is a Covenant community. Trailer parks, apartment complexes, gated communities, to sort of make a minuscule example, things like, say, Discord servers or internet cliques, etc. Those are examples of Covenant communities. They're private property associations that have codified their unspoken rules and signed an agreement with other property owners to employ their property and associations to enforce those rules by means of associating with people who follow them or disassociating with people who don't follow them or go against them. And there are plenty of other differences between a Covenant community, a state, and I don't know if I have time or not to say how long do I have left.
You have 1 minute and 22 seconds.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, I'd say that a very significant thing that separates the state and Covenant communities are three things. Number one, a Covenant community contract, if it has one, absolutely must be signed. Number two, a Covenant community cannot use force, like, say, violence, that a state would use to tax, to force people to sign the contracts and abide by the rules by the same force that the state would use to tax money. Obviously, things like, say, enforcing property rights and whatnot, that is a legitimate use of force, but not coercing people into accepting the contract. And number three, if there is a dispute between an individual and the Covenant community, the arbitration is not held by the Covenant community, it is held by a third party, whereas if there is a dispute between someone and the United States government, well, guess who's going to be judging it? It's the United States government.
When it comes to the libertarian to alt-right pipeline, my problem is a lot of Hoppians tend to associate more in red pill circles. That doesn't mean that their ideology leads them there. Everyone.
All right, 5 minutes for your first rebuttal is up. Eso Filthy, you will have 5 minutes to make your first rebuttal. Your time begins now.
Who's gonna start? God damn it.
I think I'll go ahead and start. So, I mean, ultimately, I noticed that the premise that I led with when I was beginning my counter-argument has not really been addressed. It's mostly just been clarifications on the question of what Hoppe actually said about monarchy. Now, of course, it goes without saying that in Democracy the God That Failed, Hoppe was very clear. He does not endorse democracy. He does not endorse monarchism. Both are statist, both are evil, and both are horrible. However, it is also very clear that he made the argument that is favorable towards monarchy. He stated very clearly that monarchies have a lower slash longer time preference, and in so doing made the argument that a monarchy is many ways preferable to a democracy. Many people are going to read that. Many people are going to interpret that as an argument in favor of, if not monarchy, then some form of autocracy. From there, I think it lends very much into the it feeds very much into the argument that the emphasis on culture and the preservation thereof is going to be required to be done by a strongman. More importantly, because of the premise of the argument that you have to that the choice is often between one or the other of neither preferable choices, as when Atomic tried to get Eso to choose between theft or murder, that many Hoppians are going to enthusiastically choose an autocracy over a democracy, which is which is how I think the libertarian to alt-right pipeline goes through, and why we have so many people, like as Eso listed in the chat here, or yeah, in the chat, Christopher Cantwell, Trudel Tom, that guy T, Love Life and Anarchy, Christopher Chase Rachel's, Right Libertarian Universe, and others. This is why we end up seeing so many people going from libertarian to, well, authoritarian. And it's not something that Hop is consciously doing, I believe. It's just simply the logical conclusion of a lot of his premises.
This is really sort of what I mean when a lot of his premises are completely alien from libertarian philosophy. And this is also not entirely the problem of the libertarian strategy. It's also a problem of a lot of modern libertarians after the 19th century tradition not actually going into practical details about their ideas. So people will look for practical ideas, then they look towards Hoppe because he offers some practical ideas that are derived from libertarian philosophy. And arguments are not necessarily presupposing that statism is good, but make the case for how centralization is desirable and lead to these end conclusions, and that democracy is a degeneration of monarchy, and makes the case for how monarchy is desirable. He's not making the case in his conclusion that monarchy is desirable, but in his premise he asserts that monarchy has desirable traits. So it's very easy to see how libertarians, become Hoppians. But the thing is, it's not
1 minute remaining.
Well, it's not that Hoppe offers practical solutions derived from libertarian ethics. In fact, as I've made the case, libertarian ethical arguments sort of naturally lead to practical arguments against the state, such as the libertarian class argument, or the argument for decentralization being superior to central management. But what at best, the solutions Hoppe provides are a degeneration of the sort of rich continuity that libertarian philosophy had before the early 20th century. And at worst, as we've observed, it leads a lot of libertarian philosophers towards some patently incorrect conclusions, which predispose them towards
All right. That 5 minute rebuttal is over. At this point, Atomic and Hoplu, you'll have another 5 minutes for your second rebuttal.
Yeah, fuck it, man. I just need to... I'll make a video on this, because clearly this is not a topic which can be debated in an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Most topics can't. All right.
We do what we can.
It's
But
because a large part of the disagreement isn't even about the positions Hoppe is making itself, but rather the sort of underlying narrative which Hoppe constructs, which is mostly divorced from the debate itself.
All right.
Yeah,
Second
do you have a
rebuttal
timer
for.
going?
All right, second rebuttal, 5 minutes, go.
Well, here's the thing. I don't believe you addressed my argument, because you're basically the crux of your argument is not on himself or his arguments, but on the way that people interpret it. But here's the thing: if people want to interpret something the wrong way, they're gonna interpret it the wrong way. And it doesn't really make Hoppe right or wrong, or desirable or undesirable, whether he does or not. Like, you can't say that because someone misinterprets an argument, that argument is therefore worthless or invalid or undesirable or unpreferable or whatever. And again, I have to bring up my analogy again. This is akin to the kinds of people who say that PewDiePie and his occasional edgy humor is what caused, say, the Christchurch shooting. And I don't mean to make it. I don't mean to sort of associate you with the people who are saying that, but to sort of provide an example of why that argument is fallacious. But again, I have to read, and he even says, like, every speech, like, you know how Dapperton, Mr. Dapperton liked to, in his videos for a while, I don't know if he still does this or not, but he liked to bring up in every single video he did how gun stats are misinterpreted. In almost every speech that Hoppe makes, he makes his case against the state and the source of human conflict, the reason why private property exists and the reason why it's a good thing private property exists, unless it's on something like, say, banking or money, where it's not 100% relevant, but everything on ethics to history to states, he brings up that monologue. So it's clear that the people who it's clear that the people who misinterpret Hoppe and become fascios or monarchists, which even then, that's sort of a 2017, early 2018 thing. Most Hoppians of past the alt-right libertarian alliance shit have stayed Ancaps and have stayed Hoppian. That's all I think I have to say.
Alright. Well, I finally got to be able to talk. Anyway, when it comes to covenant communities, what I think you guys miss is that there doesn't have to be this is what Hoplu was getting at. You could have a commune, right? Or you could have a other type of association, but what private property does is it creates a natural state of unwritten rules for associating with other people, and those rules are influenced by people's incentives. So it's people's incentives to follow those unwritten rules, and that can be the basis of a covenant community. So if you have any type of community which has any type of rule, whether influenced by incentives, unwritten or written, is still a covenant community. And there doesn't need to be a central system of there doesn't need to be a central system of arbitration.
1 minute remaining.
Said that. What needs to happen is it can either just be neighbors who say, okay, get out of our property. You know, you either sign this contract or whatever. And I think, now that I'm thinking about it, you could, when it has an unwritten rule, you could say, well, yeah, I've gone in circles. I've gone in circles.
All right, do you wish to forfeit your remaining 30 seconds?
Poplu, do you have anything to say?
Not really.
All right, that brings an end to your second rebuttal period. Eso Filthy, you have 5 minutes for your second rebuttal. Your 5 minutes begin now.
Sure, I guess I'll start off this time. Well, first of all, the idea that there's some sort of unwritten rules implied in association or property, that's just patently absurd because there's no objective way through which to communicate or through which information is interpreted. That's going to be entirely relative to each individual who actually looks at a situation and assesses their interests against sort of narratives. It can vary in as many ways as the factors which actually influence their human action in the first place. So you're not going to get sort of a universal standard out of property alone. The reason that you'll get a social order in an anarchy is as a result of competition and the decentralized arbiters which exist in that society. Therefore, having an incentive to be as objective and close to what can be demonstrated to be true as possible. Natural law is not a sort of a normative ethical state. It is a descriptive one, and it's one which exists because actually, as something that Hoppe rightly pointed out, one of the sort of fundamental bases by which human action can occur and based upon like sort of trade or whatever is a sort of stable social order, but which is why I would argue that out of a purely decentralized society you can establish a social order purely out of descriptive observation and through decentralized competition. I think that utility argument that Hoppe attempts to make, at best, covenant communities, therefore, are not really a realistic description of how people would associate. I mean, the comparisons that you provided, for example, to modern examples, trailer parks or how YouTubers associate through the platform. Well, first of all, trailer parks are largely created as a result of socially dysgenic effects that the state creates on society through artificial scarcity. They're created mainly to alleviate costs of actually living there. To some extent, they're meant for the ability to maintain property values, which is really only important because of the stock market, which is again something that exists largely because of ants restrictions created by the state. Another problem with that, though, is you seem to confuse hierarchical covenant communities with networks of producers, which in the case of Discord servers, YouTube channels, or these sort of open source groups like Defense Distributed, I would say they're closer to a decentralized network than they are a covenant community, because the sort of standards which they've created are contributions made by each individual member and are not really enforced by one person or created by one person. They're sort of an average of the interests of every person in that group, and every person sort of has an equal in these decentralized networks has a sort of equal level of communication with one another. I think that therefore that would be a more accurate representation of what social order is like in the absence of any sort of socially dysgenic effects the state creates. Individuals associating and speculating with their own resources towards their own mutual interests with others, mainly to alleviate costs and for asset security. Unless Filthy had something to say, I'm done.
Yeah, the main thing I just wanted to say is a simple observation, and that is that the way Hop is misinterpreted, as Hoplu has pointed out, is rather unique in terms of philosophical works. I don't know very many people of.
Let him
guess
continue.
not.
He barely got any time to talk.
All right.
I'll try to keep it brief. So
Okay,
people,
provided there's no objections from Atomic and Eso, I'll give him 2 minutes.
Let
Okay.
him go.
All right.
all right. So people don't typically see Rembrandt's paintings and assume it's a beautiful musical composition. People don't read Karl Marx, and that suddenly makes them a believer in the Nordic religion, in the old Nordic religions of Old Norse mythology. So the interpretation that is incredibly common, and I think we both agree that it's pretty common among readers and not even just passing fans of Hop, is incredibly unique, because you have a supposedly libertarian author whose ideas are responsible for creating a lot of authoritarians. And this is something that doesn't usually happen with other libertarian philosophers. There's not a lot of Rothbardians that take Rothbard's ideas as inspiration to cause them to become monarchists. There's not a lot of Spoonerites that take Spooner's ideas and use that as a justification to justify military juntas. It's a fairly unique phenomena that I've only ever seen among followers of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche trying to warn people against nihilism, being cited as a foundation for the philosophical underlyings of nihilism. So if Hop is being misinterpreted, it's a rather strange rather strange case of misinterpretation, which suggests either a weakness in Hop's ideas or a weakness in the way he conveys them. I'm finished.
You had 10 seconds left. All right. At this point, we had initially planned to move on to a second topic. However, as was already noted, seems to be a lot more to be said, so I will put it to both sides of the debate. Do you wish to continue this topic more, or do you want to move on to another topic?
Well, Dorism was going to be an interesting topic. It's just, I think this format is proving to be terrible for this debate, and I've had multiple debates on Hoppeanism, and all of them have had sort of the same fundamental problems, which I pointed out earlier. So I don't know. I would try, I guess, for the Hoppian debate, we can try and have another debate, but at this point, I think that it would just be more productive to make videos about it or essays about it.
I think that the best thing we can do in this case is just have natural discussions about it, recorded if we want to. But
well, yeah, we can have discussions about it. It's just that there's never going to be a debate where you're going.
I know.
It would take days to go into every single little nuance or aspect with disagreement lies, and that's sort of, you know, the main but that's, you know, I guess to try and communicate better, you know, you keep coming back. I think the fact you keep coming away with, I'm saying Hop is a literal monarchist, and I keep saying, no, he's not. I just think that his conclusions disposing people towards political rule being favorable in their perspective, that really shows that there's a fundamental difference in the presuppositions and the premise by which these two approaches are based upon.
Right.
That is why it would take too much time to actually do a full in-depth debate about this, because there's essentially you would have to go over everything, and you would have to go over dozens of different points on every one of these hundreds of little smaller points.
I would suggest that we should do another debate, only with a different format, next week. Sound good this time?
Probably not.
All right.
And from the moderators,
I was just going to suggest that the topic be on secessionism versus agorism.
Yes, thank you.
We were going to go into that topic, but we basically ran out of time.
Yeah, I've
we're
got
already
work to
now.
do.
What I'm going to say from the moderator's perspective, if we're going to have another debate on Hoppe, I might suggest seeing if we can narrow the topic. I know, Eso, you're saying there are too many nuances to be covered in one debate. If that's the case, perhaps try and identify what you think some of those nuances are, and then make that into a debate unto itself. Do several debates about more narrow topics within the issue.
I suppose I could sit and mull it over, but, I'm looking at sort of how this turned out and how every other debate I've had turned out, and the same problem occurs. It's a problem with the fundamental presuppositions which make up the two different points of views perspective. And I think that when you get down to debating premises, the only meaningful debate that'll really be had is over premises, which is really not even a debate about Hoppeanism about that point. It's a debate about metaphysical nitpicking.
I like to point out time to time that it's more so the historical things that have happened related to Hoppe, namely the Red Pillar's attraction to him in 17 late early 18, which has kind of collapsed at this point, but
Yeah, well, that's another thing that I've observed. I mean, most of the libertarian political movement online has, over time, thankfully gravitated more towards, like, the 19th century individualist tradition of using counter-economics, etc. But that's the thing. All the people who were Hoppians or were attracted to Hoppians, they're no longer libertarians.
not really. I can name tons of people.
You can name
But-
Tom Woods, and that's really about it. Everybody else.
Bob Murphy, Stephen Kinsella. I don't need to go into listing a bunch of names like that. It's just anecdotal evidence, but I think there's about enough said here.
That is essentially what listing
Yeah.
names
Are we all good on a debate next week? This time on on secessionism versus agorism?
Yeah, sure. Just one last thing I had to say, though. Your comments about Spooner, holy fuck, that made me cringe so hard.
What I'm saying is that
incredibly brief.
what I'm saying is sort of the overpraising of democracy in the sense that it was a step up or it was progress.
He does not state that once. He my position, which is that all states are antagonistic towards the interests of the people they rule over, and each state is essentially just operating under models which that state deems to be more beneficial to its own interests. Which that's, by the way, another interesting thing I'd like to note, not really related to the debate at this point, but have you noticed how, like, the European Union, the United States, China, a lot of these countries which need to spend more have adopted, like, crypto mercantilist economic models for how they trade? Well, that's an actual interesting observation, which I haven't really seen a whole lot of other libertarians note, except for the sort of Conkinites or Roderick T. Long crowd. At states
Very
when they
inherent for a state to want to engage in mercantilism. But
when
I was
state-
more so referring to people like Frederick Bastiat than Spooner, but I don't know what Spooner's differentiation between monarchy and republics or democracies are.
Spooner was completely averse to any concept of political authority. He treated them identically as, in the way he described it, government. The distinction between a government and a band of criminals is essentially just what they call themselves. So
Well,
he would have been just
One
as
ma-
antagonistic towards monarchy as democracy.
well, one last thing I will say, and like, just this is the last thing, so we don't so we don't be here all night. But Hoppe, again, he doesn't really say that one is more or less ethical in the sense that, having a monopoly on arbitration or ultimate decision making and the right to pillage people is 10 or 20% more okay if it's a democracy. I mean, if it's a monarchy than a democracy. He more so says that if you want more destruction, more pillaging, more war, evil, etc., that's what a democracy is for. But if you want less pillaging, less destruction, less war, etc., that generally happens in monarchies. It's sort of a I don't know.
I'm sorry. That's just. I'm not like trying to insult you or anything. It's just that to India or Africa when mercantilism was still the dominant model. Had to spend so much. It basically relied on imperialism to fund itself.
Basically, it was the Roman Empire, an economy funded entirely by pillaging.
Yeah, I know that model, but that's the less. I won't argue further.
Well, I have to agree with Hoplu that if everyone keeps saying this is the last thing, this discussion is just going to keep going. So
yeah. So, anyways, yeah.
This point is, I didn't
recording
think we
here.
were even still.